It's also creating like this diamond effect with the stitch lines. Even points on the patchwork squares and those perfect lines going through those points. Lots of structure to the bag. Hi friends, I'm Brittany, the mom and maker behind Ginger Patch Designs, and today I'm going to show you how to take a basic tote bag pattern and completely customize it, make several changes to get a completely different looking bag. Now, if you're wondering why this bag is unfinished, this is because this is part of a mini series. There's gonna be several modifications to the exterior, the lining, the pockets. I'm gonna share with you how you can use the same measurements from your baseline pattern and use those measurements to make modifications to get a completely different looking, really cool bag. I'll be using my beginner-friendly Charlotte tote bag pattern that I have linked down below for you as a reference in today's video, but you can really apply a lot of these things to any tote bag pattern that you have. This part one video of the mini series is going to focus on the exterior of the bag. 4 main parts of the exterior that you can change to really give your bag a whole new look. So we're gonna focus on taking the exterior panel from a single panel to a patchwork, thread quilting technique, and interfacing. How interfacing changes a bag structure. Cotton batting is very durable, it's soft, but it is a little bit floppy. If I were to put this bag on the counter, it's not going to stay up. I like cotton batting bags for yarn and like on-the-go crafty projects, but if you need something with some more structure to it, like if you're gonna put your laptop in here, some books maybe, and you want it to be able to have structure when you put it on a table, high loft polyester batting is what we're going to be working with today. There's 2 ways you can achieve the patchwork squares. You can buy charm packs or mini charm packs and literally sew each of the squares together, like 1 by 1, and that's a great option for beginners because there's no cutting involved. It is more sewing and maybe a little bit more math, which patchwork math can be very, very confusing for beginners, but that is a great option if you would like to. Today, I'm going to show you the strip method, which is where you create long strips of fabric in however many colors that you want, and you sew them together and create your patchworks from there. My recommendation for how much fabric do you actually need for your project is, whether you're following the Charlotte tote bag pattern or you're following your own tote bag pattern and adjusting, however much fabric for your exterior panels that your pattern calls for, I would double it. For example, in the Charlotte tote bag pattern, the exterior panels call for ½ yard of fabric. So for this project, I would get a whole yard of fabric total, depending on how many colors I'm using. Today, I'm actually gonna be using 2 different colors, so I would have gotten ½ yard for each color. Today, I'm gonna show you how to do 2½ inch squares using 2 different kinds of fabric. And we're starting with 2 kinds of fabric because that's really manageable for beginners. Again, I'm using the Charlotte tote bag pattern as an example, and I would need ½ yard of 1 type of fabric. So I would cut 2½ inch strips all the way down until I got to my ½ yard. Now the last cut would be at 17½ inches. If I had the extra fabric, I would go ahead and do another 2½ inches. If I'm lacking any, I can make it from scraps, and I'll show you how to do that as well. Now, if you are not cutting from a full piece of yardage and you are using scraps like I am, this is a disassembled bag that I really didn't love, but I really loved the fabric because it's designer and I wanted to salvage it. You would cut 2½ inch strips, and ideally, whatever the height of your panel needs to be, whether your panel is 12 inches, 15 inches, 20 inches, whatever it is, ideally you would want to make the height of your strips an inch taller than that. For example, if your panels are 18 inches tall, I would make them 19 inches just to give yourself wiggle room for shrinkage when it comes to the multiple seam allowances and the quilting process involved. You can always trim off extra later. It's better to have too much than not enough. Again, if you are cutting your pieces from a larger piece of yardage, then cut your strips to however much the height of your bag is plus an inch. Now my last strip is right here at 20 inches, but it's not enough because we have to account for seam allowance. So we're gonna have a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each of these strips. So that means we need to account for that and add more yardage over here. So I'm gonna go ahead and add another strip. Again, if it ends up being too wide, we can always trim. The next step is to sew your strips together. So you're gonna fold each pair right sides together, meaning pretty sides touching. Now take it to your machine and using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, stitch on the right side of each of these strips. Friends, if you just want the yardage math, I included a free planning worksheet down in the description for you. And if you want a full breakdown of all things patchwork, how to do yardage math for all different kinds of square sizes, the entire patchwork process from start to finish, I'm actually working on a patchwork companion guide. It's not quite ready yet, but if you like my teaching style, you can click the link down below to get on the wait list where you'll get early access and a discount when it's ready. Now notice I didn't pin or clip these. It's really not necessary because you can easily adjust. Like if the fabric becomes off center here, you can just pull it back over. When I say seam allowance, that is the width between the needle to the edge of the fabric. Now most needle plates have a 1/4 inch seam allowance marked on the needle plate, but if it's not, you can manually measure and mark with a marker on your needle plate. So I'm gonna put this edge of the fabric where that 1/4 inch seam allowance line is, and then lower my presser foot. Also, I'm using polyester thread because it's much stronger for tote bags, and I'm using a 2mm stitch length. And if you're ever not sure if the strips are lined up, just stop with the needle down, pick it up, check it, and readjust. If you struggle with sewing straight lines and following the seam allowance guide, my 2 tips are to slow down. I know it's super fun but if you're struggling with straight lines, then that's not what you need to do. And also, I'm guiding with both hands here. I've got this hand back here, keeping the fabrics lined up the way I want, and then this hand is guiding along. It's not pushing. The feed dogs underneath, those teeth thingies, are pushing the fabric. I'm just guiding it in a way that it's staying where I want it to. Now take your strips that you just made and open them back up, placing them where it's alternating colors. Same thing again, making sure the colors are alternating. We're gonna put these 2 pieces together, and then we're gonna put these 2 pieces together. You could go ahead and put that one on there if you want to, or just wait until you get these ones done. Now, a little trick that I have learned, even though we are being very meticulous with our seam allowance, patchwork can be very fickle. So when I start placing pieces together like this, I line up these seams first, and I put a little pin right there. And for me, I don't pin the rest of this all the way down, I just stitch it. But if you are new and you're learning, go ahead and take some pins. I don't recommend quilt clips when it comes to patchwork because they're not good at really securing things in place as good as pins, as much as I love quilt clips. I'm always glad when stuff doesn't go perfectly according to plan in my tutorials so that I have the opportunity to show you like how to troubleshoot things. So even though I lined up these seams perfectly, it was just a little bit off. Like it's not quite as wide as the other piece. So I pinned it with the seams lined up where they're supposed to go. And this, you'll never see this. We will cover that up with seam allowance, but it's more important to have our seams lined up. This could be a variety of things, even though I was very meticulous with my seam allowance. It's likely that this particular strip was just a smidge, not as wide as the other one. Again, I pulled this from scraps and was really trying to make the fabric last. So if you're experiencing that using scraps, it's completely normal. So take these back to your machine and stitch those sides. Now, if you've sewn your strips together and you think you've got enough, and then you go to put it on your cutting mat, and it's not the width that you need it to be because of seam allowance, every time you stitch a side together, that's a 1/2 inch lost due to seam allowance on the back. So you might have started at the width that you needed, but you actually need to add, for every piece that you sew together, you need an extra 1/2 inch this way. But the great news is at this step, it's very easy to fix. All you need to do is add more strips of fabric, however many you need to get to the width that you need. I'm gonna add 2 more strips here on the end before we go to the next step. Once you have the approximate width, after like pulling it out a little bit because we haven't ironed, the approximate width of how big your panel is gonna be, again, it's better to have too wide than not enough. And if you're already thinking like, well, if I'm changing the outside measurements, does that mean the inside's gonna change? Yes, it does, and we will get to that. And we're gonna open all of these seams. And now what I mean by open is we're gonna iron them open. Usually with pieces, we would iron the seams on the front side of the piece to flatten the seams, right? And make it nice and flat. But when it comes to patchwork and quilting items, the seams need to be open to reduce bulk. So what I like to do is just get it started with my thumb right here, and your iron should have a pointy end right here, and you can use that pointy end to guide the seam and just slowly press. You might be tempted to skip this step because it does take a little bit extra time and you have to go a little bit slower, but we're gonna have a lot of seams going on, as you'll see here in just a few minutes. And so taking the time to do this will just really help reduce some of that bulk when it comes to quilting. Now that you've pressed all your seams open and you've got your panel and it is the width that you need, we're ready to start cutting some squares. We're going to shift our piece and square up the edges. We want all of our strips here to be even. So after you've evened up this line, you're going to start cutting 2.5-inch squares going this way, and you're going to go very slowly if you're new so that your ruler doesn't slip. I like to put my pinky finger over here on the edge to hold it. If you don't have a handle like me, don't push this way on your ruler. We have a tendency to lean into our cuts. You don't want to do that. That's what's going to make your ruler slip. Keep your body back away from your cutting mat. You can lean over it a little bit, but just don't put your weight on that ruler. Hold that with your pinky finger and measure twice, cut once. Now, if you're looking at that thinking that does not look square, it's not square yet. We cut it at the 2.5-inch mark on our cutting mat, but it's not going to have that really pretty square look until we sew the rest of these strips together. So just go down your mat, the length. So just go all the way down your mat. So once you've cut all your strips, you're going to shift everything this way. This is why it's important to have opposite fabrics on each end of your strip, because now we'll leave this one like this. We're going to flip this one, and this is how your patchwork comes to life. Leave that one and then flip this one around. Now, if you are using yardage that you cut from the full strips and you have plenty of width and height to your panel and you are ready for the next step, you can skip ahead to the next segment that I will put on the screen right here. If you are using scraps like me and you don't quite have the height that you need, like me, you've got your width, but I need a few more strips up here that look like this to get the height that I need. You can do this a few ways depending on the scraps that you have. If you have a few more strips, you can sew those together, cut your 2.5-inch squares, and then sew those strips together. For example, however many squares you have on your width, I have 10 on my width. That's how many squares I'm going to need to sew together to get another one of these strips. So you can do it that way. Or if you have individual squares left because you're using scraps, you might have to sew little bits together to get what you need. As long as your square is 2.5 inches to accommodate for that seam allowance, even if you have to sew them together individually, it should be okay. Now, if you are adding your extra rows up here, remember, we have to account for seam allowance. So for me, when I'm adding this extra, what's going to be another row right here, that's actually the height that I need. But it's actually not, because none of these strips are sewn together. Remember, we're going to lose 1/2 inch. For every gap in your strips, that's a 1/2 inch that you have to accommodate for. So I've got 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 1/2, 2, 2.5, three inches that I'm going to lose once I sew all of these strips together this way. So if I need this to be my height, I need to add another row up here to accommodate that. Now, once you have all your strips, you've got the width that you need, you've got the height that you need. And again, if you're not sure if you have the right width and height, you can still add some squares later in the next step if you need to. Patchwork is somewhat flexible in that you can always add until you get to the quilting phase. So the next step is to once again sew the strips together like before, but this time it's going to be a little bit different because we need to match up the seams. This is the step that is really going to show that having an even seam allowance is very, very important. So what I like to do when I go to flip this layer up like this, I actually put it a little bit above so that I can see this seam and see how they're lining up. You see how they line up all the way down? Okay, so we're going to pin this one, and then I'm going to show you what to do if they don't line up. You can still fix it at this step. So once they line up, I pull it down and I pin. Also, pinning preference, like you can pin it this way. I'm a lefty, and so it's just easier for me to pin this way. It really doesn't matter, whatever's comfortable for you. The only reason that people pin this way is so that they can sew over them, but if you're new and terrified of sewing over pins, just pin it like this with the head of the pin to the left, because you're going to be sewing it like this in your machine, and that way, like as it's feeding through your machine, you can just pull them out. And as you get each strip ready, you can just lay it to the side. Here, so let me show you how to spot if the seams don't line up. So let's say you do this little method, you pull it up, and let's say the first three are even, and then you get to this one and it looks like this, like the seam is off. It's one of two things. Either this strip or square is cut unevenly, or your seam allowance is uneven. So if this seam is even, but this one is off, that means that it's this square right here. So let's say it's this far off. This is where it's supposed to be, and this is where your actual stitch is. You can take a pencil, and I would not mark where the stitch is supposed to be, because remember, when you go to sew this back together, you're going to be taking some of this one with you, unless this one is off too. But if this one lines up where it's supposed to be, then I wouldn't mess with that. So I would make a pencil mark somewhere in the middle here. Biscuit, shush. A pencil mark in the middle. Take it to your machine, go like this, and sew along that pencil mark line, and then bring it back and remeasure, like line up all your seams once again, and see if that did the trick. It might take some trial and error, but that usually is what works for me. Now we're going to take all these to our machine. So when you're sewing these strips together, even though you have it pinned, sometimes they like to become off center. So just make sure that you are starting your stitching with them lined up properly. 1/4 inch seam allowance again, making sure they're nice and even. Notice how we're also sewing over our pressed seam allowance. Now sometimes they don't want to stay down when approaching the presser foot. Sometimes they'll do this. But if you see that coming, I'm so sorry about my cat. She is fed, she is loved, she's very needy. But you can stop your presser foot and lift it up and just push it back under. And to prevent that from happening, this is another reason going slower is better, is just hold your finger over it and it'll just go right under. Also, when you get to the end of the strip, sometimes the strips like to get a little squirrely. So I like to just keep my finger on it and keep it straight. You see how this purple square is smaller than the one underneath. Again, I probably was just 1/8 of an inch off on my measurements, and I was trying to make the fabric last as long as I could. That is okay. It is centered on the square underneath, and it's more important that the seams line up. If the seams line up and there's still a healthy amount left for the seam allowance, open up the strips that you just sewed, and you're basically gonna do the same thing again, just with these larger pieces. I saw this coming, but I let it happen anyways, just so I could show you. So this is why it's important to always check both sides of your seams to make sure you caught your seam allowance, because my stitch there at the end kind of went willy-nilly. And the reason for that is the seams, like if you press it down the way it is right now, my seams are way off. But if I were to line up my seams, it was supposed to be over a little bit more. But the good news is, if you catch it at this phase, you can just pick those stitches, maybe about to like right here, and then start your stitching back here and just fix it. And now we have to open those seams again. So we have our open seams that were going this way, and now we're gonna open them again. The goal is not to have every single seam pressed down. I mean, that would be great, but it's not always realistic once you get everything stitched together. But if you can press down as much as you can, that would be very helpful in alleviating a lot of that bulk. Once you have one quilt panel done, you're gonna wanna do that exact same process for the second quilt panel. Now, after you have both quilt panels done, you're gonna grab some batting. Now, the type of batting that you use will affect the structure of it. If you use a lighter batting like cotton, it's gonna be very floppy. This is really great for like yarn bags and project bags. If you use a high loft polyester, it's going to be stiffer. It's gonna still have some flexibility to it. I wouldn't call it floppy, but it is going to have a defined bottom to it that will give the bag some structure. If you have basting spray, go ahead and give that a little spritz. If you have no idea what this is, girl, you got to get you some. I'll link it down in the description below. It's not glue. It literally bastes the fabric in place and just holds it in place so that you can quilt small projects without having to use pins. If you don't have basting spray, because you're going to get some because it's awesome, you can just use some pins that you have after you smooth it down from the center going out, making sure that we don't have any wrinkles if possible. You can take some of your sewing pins and just scatter them throughout just to hold it in place. Paying particular attention to the edges. No, we have to be professional. No. So once you have both of your panels patchwork together, you've got them basted or pinned onto your batting, it is time to quilt. Now, another way that you can really change up a base pattern and make it very customizable is with your quilting options. In my Charlotte tote bag pattern, we just do straight line quilting because it is for beginners, but the pattern is designed in a way that you can build on your baseline skills. So you can go from straight line quilting, which is just straight lines, to where you're then doing both vertical and horizontal stitches. Patchwork squares are a great way to really vary your quilting options, because you can either follow either side of the stitch lines like this, or you can do what I'm going to do, which is a crosshatch variation. Now, when it comes to small projects, not big quilts, smaller projects, I like to start in the middle. I pick a corner and I follow the points of the patchwork, and that's my guide. You don't have to make quilting lines when you do it like this, because the points are already lined up for you. You just follow those lines. Now, you can make quilting lines or follow a quilting bar if you would like, but you don't have to. Another way that you can vary your quilting technique is through the top thread color that you choose. I tell beginners that honestly, neutral colors, that's all you need to start. You do not need to match your thread color to each quilt top. Usually I just use white, but if you're feeling really fancy, you can buy different colors. I'm going to be using a medium purple on the top, and then I'm using that polyester white on the bobbin thread. And to start these corners, I kind of just smooth it down like this to make sure that there's not going to be any unnecessary bunching. Just following the points. If if you notice what I'm doing with my hands as I'm going along, yes, I've got the pins in there, I've basted the fabric, but I'm spreading as I go. I'm spreading and I'm allowing the feed dogs to feed the fabric, but I'm just guiding and spreading the fabric. I'm guiding along these points right here, and I'm also preventing bunching. So now I'm just going to repeat that whole process going in the opposite direction. I'm going to shift my piece starting in the other square. When you start at this square and there's like this little flap hanging out, you want to make sure you smooth it down when you go to put it under your presser foot, just because if you don't smooth it down, say you just kind of like this, and then when you go to stitch, you're going to get a bunch right there. So make sure you smooth it all the way down. If you did all of your smoothing when you were making all of these lines, you shouldn't have any bunching. If you see texture right here, that is due to the high loft batting on the back. So this kind of quilting actually creates a really amazing visual component. You have squares, right? Patchwork squares, but because you're crosshatch quilting it at an angle, it's also creating like this diamond effect with the stitch lines. And so it's just a really neat variation of quilting. After you've done all of your beautiful quilting however you wanted to do it, you didn't have to do it the way I did, obviously, and you've trimmed up all the excess and you've squared up all of the edges, you just assemble your panels as you would according to your pattern directions. After you finish your corners, as your pattern directions say, you should be able to just drop it on the table and it just sits there. It's a little floppy like this because it is an unfinished bag. Friends, don't forget the free patchwork planning guide down below and to get on the wait list for the full patchwork companion when it is ready, and hopefully just a few weeks after this video goes live. If you're watching this later on, I will make sure to link the full patchwork companion when it is ready. Friends, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I will see you later. Bye.